And can I start by saying I'm delighted that I think everybody has said, with a degree of reluctance, with a degree of frustration, but I think everybody has accepted that this statutory instrument which we are discussing and debating here this evening, while not wanted, is nonetheless necessary. And I do thank everybody for saying that they will support it, therefore, sometimes with a heavy heart. I think that goes for all of us, but nonetheless that they will support it even so. And I appreciate and recognise that degree of cross-party support. I think it is more powerful because it is cross-party. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is not to say that the frustrations are not real, that the frustrations have not been clearly and effectively expressed this evening. We have had a whole litany of examples from all sides of the House of the kinds of decisions, the lengthening list of decisions which are not being taken because Stormont is not currently operational. And we've had examples from all sorts of people. The honourable gentleman from Strangford, who just spoke, gave examples of a lady with a premature baby, of a grandmother left on a hospital waiting trolley for too long. But there have been others as well. And my honourable friend from Lewis gave a long list of missed opportunities, as did the Select Committee Chair, the honourable gentleman from South West Wiltshire. And I think there has been a repeated refrain from all sides that we cannot, I think, if I'm quoting the Select Committee Chair, cannot keep kicking the can down the road, was his phrase. The honourable gentleman, if I can just finish this point, the honourable gentleman from Lagan Valley said that the mountains in front of us are no higher than those we have scaled in the past. But he also says that bread and butter issues are far better done by locally elected politicians in Stormont. I'll happily give way to the...
Thank the Minister for State for giving way, but it's in light of legislation which took place recently in relation to the Buick case, and where permanent secretaries were needing cover to allow them to make decisions. Permanent secretaries are still not signing off what is non-controversial decisions. They are using the frustration of no assembly as an excuse not to do business.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure everybody here would appreciate that the senior civil servants in the Northern Ireland Civil Service are faced with a very, very difficult position. They are being required to keep the wheels of good government turning, and in fact the EF Act equips them to do that, but clearly they have to be extremely careful not to try and take new policy decisions which should rightly and correctly and constitutionally be taken by elected politicians in Stormont. That would clearly be wrong. That is out with the powers in the EF Act. And I think it perhaps answers the question asked by the honourable gentleman for Paisley and Renfrewshire North, who said, what are the stresses on the administration? And the answer is simply that people are being asked to operate up to the limits of what they can decently and constitutionally do, and it is requiring a great deal of care and a great deal of civil service professionalism to make sure that they go up to those limits but no further. And I don't think that we can reasonably ask them to continue doing that for a very great deal of time longer, not least because, as people have been rightly pointing out, the list of problems which are left unsolved because they require a political intervention, a political decision, is getting longer every day. And I'll happily give way.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Minister for giving way. And it's just to re-emphasise a point that my honourable friend from South Antrim is making. I understand the caution in the Minister's response and the balance that senior civil servants have to make in the public interest, and there's a matrix in this bill as to how those decisions should be made. But the truth is, some permanent secretaries, some departments are more willing to use the powers afforded to them under this bill than others. And I think there needs to be a fair appreciation of that and an encouragement to the head of the civil service to say, for as long as this bill pertains, for as long as we don't have active, devolved institutions, for as long as there is a democratic deficit and decisions can be made, they should be made. And I would really encourage them to meet with us to go through that in finer detail, because some permanent secretaries are using it to its full force, others are not, and they should be encouraged to do so.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I share the frustration on all sides about this. I think that we need to be extremely careful here, because it may be clear to one person on one side of this House, another person on another side of this House, that a particular department in the Northern Ireland Civil Service is acting to the full extent of its powers, or perhaps drawing back a little further from using those full powers. But the point about it is that is, at some point, that becomes a political judgment rather than a professional civil service judgment. And where it becomes a political judgment, then at that point, the answer, of course, as I think many people on all sides of this debate have already said, rightly so far this evening, is for there to be an executive at Stormont and for the devolved assembly to come back into play, because ultimately, until that happens, then the judgment of the civil servants has to be just that. It has to be something which is within the scope of the Act. But it is very, very hard for politicians to say this civil servant is doing a good job, that civil servant is doing a bad job, unless we get the politicians in place in Stormont in order, who have the natural legal locus and the democratic mandate in order to do so. I'll happily give way to the Honourable Lady.
Giving way. Although he has stated that perhaps that this could go into a political judgment in terms of civil servants, the reality is the law is there. There are parameters around the exercise of the powers given within that legislation, and what we would like to see is a consistency in terms of the discretion that each of the permanent secretaries or senior civil servants would have. I asked the Secretary of State on a previous occasion to consider looking at guidance being issued to permanent secretaries so to get that type of consistency. I think what all of us are finding at the moment is that there is a disparity in the way that permanent secretaries and senior civil servants are operating the powers that they have been given objectively within this bill.
Madam Deputy, I accept that there will be different views about whether or not some departments are using those powers, as I said, to their full extent and others not. I think it is, to coin the phrase used by the honourable gentleman who speaks for the Labour Party and who spoke second in this debate, it's a primrose path that we're being asked to tread down here, to say, well, this particular part of the Northern Ireland Civil Service is using those powers to its full extent, this one isn't. Ultimately, this has to be something which is decided by and led by and ultimately arbitrated by the devolved Assembly and the devolved ministers. And all of us feel this frustration, but I think it's becoming a rather circular argument if we say that we should be trying to push them one way or push them another. We have to set those rules, but ultimately, if people aren't happy with the way they're being applied, providing they're being used within the rules of the law which we have set in the EFEF Act, then it is up to the Northern Ireland Assembly. And I'm afraid it is as fundamental and as simple and as difficult a truth as that the only answer is for the Northern Ireland Assembly to come back. And I'll happily give way again.
He has said a number of times that he shares the frustration of what my colleagues have said tonight. But why is it that the government will not go ahead, call the Assembly, those that turn up, get it moving and get it working for the people of Northern Ireland? Why will the government not do that?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I bring the honourable gentleman good news, which is that my colleague, the Secretary of State, has many, many talents and powers, but one of them is not to call the Assembly in this sort of portentous phrase which a number of us have been using so far this evening. In fact, the Assembly is still legally in existence. If MLAs want to turn up tomorrow, or perhaps the day after tomorrow, given the sad and tragic events that are happening tomorrow, if they want to turn up, nobody needs to call them to do so. They have a legal right to turn up, open the doors and do so. And when they do turn up, they are then entitled to try and select firstly a Speaker and then choose a Chief Minister and Deputy First Minister. Doesn't require Secretary of State to call them to do it. And we've had several calls this evening for some sort of a trial to see whether or not people will actually turn up and do that. If MLAs from any sides of the community, from any political party, are so minded, they can do that should they so want to. I will leave it up to them, of course, as directly, locally elected politicians to decide if they wish to do that, but they can, and legally they are entitled to do that should they wish. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't want to detain the House any longer. I'm conscious of the passage of time. Just very briefly, and then I will just try and answer one more question and sit down.
I admire the Minister of State greatly, and he's doing a valiant job with and he mentioned only 2 paragraphs in this SI, and he doesn't have a lot of material, I understand that, but he really is trying to put everything else onto other people here. It's up to the parties to call the Assembly, it's up to people. Does he not take any responsibility Does he not take any responsibility for the state of affairs in Northern Ireland that his government is responsible for in breach of his own manifesto commitments? Will he not answer that point?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman leads me on to my next point, which is a response to several people asking for some kind of a roadmap. What happens next? Now, clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, it will depend on the reactions of the individual parties, but one of the things which the government has a responsibility for, and which we have been trying to do, and we will continue to try and do, is to try and bring talks to get Stormont back together again to a successful conclusion, to get them started, to get them continued, and to get them successfully concluded. So a number of people asked me about what the roadmap to take this forward might be. And as the Secretary of State set out to the House on the 21st of March, she's spoken to the Northern Ireland parties and the Irish Government on a number of occasions over recent weeks. In those discussions, all the parties have been consistent. All the parties have been consistent in their commitment to restoring a power-sharing executive and the other political institutions set out in the Belfast Agreement. So we believe that the five main parties are in favour of taking forward a short and focused set of round-table talks to restore devolution at the earliest opportunity, and the Irish Government also supports this approach. So, any such talks processes will involve the UK Government, the five main parties and the Irish Government, taking place in full accordance with a well-established three-stranded approach. A number of people, Madam Deputy Speaker, have said that, without wishing to prejudge anything, and certainly not to anticipate things when the funeral of Lyra McKee is due to take place tomorrow. But people have said, during the course of the earlier statement this evening, that there may just be a glimmer of light. There may just be a change of view, a change of tone in Northern Ireland. That is tremendously important, and if that is the case, then this kind of approach will be necessary. I completely accept what the honourable gentleman from North Belfast was pointing out. We need to try and convene that if we possibly can, and also, therefore, to create the breathing space in which that kind of a change of tone, that kind of a change of approach can flourish and develop, if at all possible. And therefore, and I was about to sit down, I have 1 minute and then I really must. But
grateful indeed to the Minister for allowing me to take the 1 minute the Minister has.
30 seconds, Sylvia.
Earlier this evening, no one in this chamber could have been unmoved by the very dignified and very moving tribute paid by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to Lyra McKee. I want to ask the Minister, and I think people are entitled to know, how that tribute is going to be translated by the Secretary of State and by the Northern Ireland Office into tangible change in Northern Ireland. We want change in Northern Ireland, led by the Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I've just answered what the next steps will be. Clearly, it will be then for the people involved in those talks to make them come to fruition. They have to be led and convened by the government, but they will require everybody else's involvement too. I've laid out what the process will be. I agree with her that no one could have failed to be moved. There is a possibility here. There is an opportunity here. We must grasp it if we can. This SI, the statutory instrument this evening, creates that moment, that breathing space which may allow it to happen. I hope, therefore, that everybody will grasp the opportunity which is thus created and will grasp it with both hands.
The question is the motion on Northern Ireland as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Thank you. We now come to motion on exiting the European Union.